Hey everybody, this is a section from Anselm Jappe's book, Debord. The part that this section is from is the concept of the spectacle, which is part one of the book. I'm going to read these. The parts are very long. There's 3 parts, and the book's 150 pages. I think there's 3 parts. Let me check again, so I'm not talking out my bum. Yeah, there's 3 parts, and it ends on page 161. So these parts are a little too long to make one video. So I'm just going to release these all as individual sections. Okay? So I think people usually would prefer to listen to a short video than to a long one. Makes you feel smarter when you're done, you know? I was like, I just got through this thing, and it's so fast. You get the gratification of completion. I think if I recorded this video, just straight shot, it might be like 3 hours or something like that, so I'm just going to read the sections. Anyway, the last section was titled Debord and Lukács. Today, this video is titled, or the section that I'm reading in this video is History and Community as the Essence of Man. So, here we go. Let's boogie. History and community as the essence of man. We have already noted that the existence of a subject whose activity can be reified obviously implies the existence of a, quote, human essence, end quote, that can serve as a yardstick by which to determine what is, quote, healthy and what is, quote, alienated, end quote. When, in 1967, Lukács criticized his own failure to distinguish in history and class consciousness between alienation and reification, Lukács states that in reality alienation exists only when, quote, the essence of man, bracket, comes, end bracket, into conflict with man's existence, end quote. And from this, Lukács deduces the need for a, quote, Marxist ontology, end quote. Debord nowhere considers constructing a, quote, ontology, end quote, but this does not necessarily rule out Debord having any conception of a, quote, human essence. Marx, in his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, conceives of such an essence in terms of man's belonging to his natural species, his Gattungswesen. Marx sees human history as part of natural history, and the natural history of man is precisely the production of human nature, which has occurred within history. Quote, the eye has become a human eye, just as the eye's object has become a social human object, end quote. For, quote, the cultivation of the 5 senses is the work of all previous history, end quote. Marx, this humanization of nature, whereby man produces man's self and becomes human himself, is understood by Marx as an organic exchange with nature and as a development of productive capabilities in the broadest sense. In Debord, likewise, we find the conception of a human essence that is not fixed, not given, but rather identical with the historical process, understood as man's self-creation in time. Quote, man, ... is one with time, end quote. Society of the spectacle. To appropriate one's own nature means first and foremost to appropriate the fact of being a historical being. In the 5th and 6th chapters of the Society of the Spectacle, which are the least often read, Debord offers a brief interpretation of history. Debord considers this historical life of man and the consciousness that he has of it to be the chief results of man's increasing domination of nature. So long as agricultural production predominated, life remained tied to natural cycles and took on the aspect of an eternal return. Historical events such as invasions by enemies seemed like problems of completely external origin. Time had a purely natural and, quote, given, end quote, quality. Time began to acquire a social dimension only with the occasion of the first ruling classes to power. Not only did these first ruling classes appropriate whatever material surplus their society contrived to produce, but inasmuch as they were not obliged to spend all their time working, they were also able to give themselves over to adventures and wars. Historical time came into existence at the pinnacle of society, even as at the bottom things remained unchanged from generation to generation. Historical time meant a time that was irreversible, a time in which events were unique and never repeated themselves. Out of this time came a wish to remember such events and to transmit that memory. This was the earliest form of historical consciousness. For a small number of people, history was already taking on a direction, a sense, a meaning. The first attempts to understand history emerged from the, quote, democracy of society's masters, end quote, characteristic of the Greek polis. Society of the Spectacle, section 134. Within the community of free citizens, at least, the problems of society could be debated openly, and in this context the conclusion was reached that the resolution of such problems depended on the power of the community, not on that of some divinity, destiny, or holy king. The material basis of society remained nonetheless bound to cyclical time. This contradiction gave rise over another long period to the compromise of semi-historical religions, in other words, to the monotheistic religions for which irreversible time, in the shape of a time waiting for a final redemption, is combined with the devaluation of concrete history deemed a mere preparation for that final event. The democratization of historical time was unable to progress until the moment when the bourgeois class, with the coming of the Renaissance, began to transform work itself. In contradistinction to earlier modes of production, capitalism accumulates and never returns to the same point. Capitalism is continually transforming the process of production and, above all, the most fundamental of these processes, namely labor itself. Thus, for the first time in history, the very foundations of society were set in motion and could therefore be exposed. Where the hell? I lost my spot. Transform work itself. In contradistinction to earlier modes of production, capitalism accumulates and never returns to the same point. Capitalism continually transforming the process of production and, above all, the most fundamental of those processes, namely labor itself. Thus, for the first time in history, the very foundations of society were set in motion and could therefore be expected to accede to linear and historical time. At precisely the same moment, however, society as a whole lost its historicity. If by historicity we mean a sequence of qualitative events, for the new irreversible time was that of the, quote, mass production of objects, end quote, and hence the, quote, time of things, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 142. The leveling out of all quality by the commodity system was manifested in the end of all traditional freedoms and privileges, as too in the complete loss of autonomy of different places. In cyclical societies, dependence on the blind forces of nature obliged submission to the decisions of those in power, whether these were based on real considerations such as irrigation in the ancient Orient, or on imaginary considerations as with the seasonal rights of priest-kings. The commodity economy presented itself as the heir of nature, and the bourgeoisie presented the bourgeoisie's self as that economy's manager. The fact that the true basis of history was the economy, that is, a product of man, was meant to remain in the unconscious. The very possibility of a history that was conscious and lived by all had to be confined to the shadows. It is in this sense that Debord interprets Marx's famous remark in The Poverty of Philosophy, according to which the bourgeoisie, having taken power, felt that there once was history, but, quote, there is no longer any history, end quote. Marx, Poverty of Philosophy, cited in Society of the Spectacle, section 143. Time under the rule of the commodity differs radically from time in earlier periods. Time under the rule of the commodity is a time of all whose moments are abstractly equivalent, varying only in a quantitative sense. Such moments function, in fact, exactly like exchange value. The importance for modern production of, quote, exactly measurable, end quote, spatialized time was analyzed as early as History and Class Consciousness by Lukács. Debord notes that the cyclical aspect has been reinstated in daily experience and the temporality of consumption, quote, day and night, weekly work and weekly rest, the cycle of vacations, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 150. In the capitalist economy, time has become a commodity just like all the others, has lost its value. Time has become a commodity that, just like all the others, has lost its use value in favor of exchange value. The organization of pseudo-events and the creation of seemingly interesting, quote, units of time, end quote, have become one of society's chief industries, as witnessed the marketing of vacations. Footnote. The club Mediterraneenne, so the Club Mediterranean, as one of the earliest and most advanced examples of the alienation of everyday life, was a frequent polemic target of the Situationist, end footnote. By contrast, irreversible and historical time can only be contemplated in the actions of others, never experienced directly in one's own life. Quote, the pseudo-events that vie for attention in the spectacle's dramatizations have not been lived by those who are thus informed about them. End quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 157. Furthermore, whatever real experience the individual manages to achieve in his daily life is alien to official time and remains unintelligible to him, for he lacks the tools to relate his own lived experience to the lived experience of society at large, and thus invest it with greater meaning. It is interesting to observe how Debord applies Marxian economic categories to historical time considered as the main product of society. Thus, in primitive society, power extracts, quote, temporal surplus value, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 128, masters enjoy, quote, the private ownership of history, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 132, quote, the main product that economic development transformed from a luxury rarity to a commonly consumed item was thus history itself, end quote, albeit only the history of things. Society of the Spectacle, section 142, and time is, quote, raw material for the production of a diversity of new products, end quote. According to Marx, the violent appropriation of the means of production of small independent producers, as well as those of peasants and craftsmen, was a prerequisite for the establishment of capitalism. Debord adds that the necessary precondition of the subjugation of workers to, quote, time as commodity, end quote, is, quote, the violent expropriation of their time, end quote. The Spectacle must deny history because history proves that laws are nothing, whereas process and struggle are all. The Spectacle is the reign of an eternal present that claims to be history's last word. Under Stalinism, it took the form of a systematic manipulation and rewriting of the past. In countries where the diffuse spectacular system holds sway, by contrast, the mechanism is subtler. To begin with, it eliminates all opportunities for people to share experiences or projects without intermediaries or to recognize themselves in their own actions and in the effects of those actions. The complete disappearance of historical intelligence creates socially atomized individuals with no choice but to contemplate the seemingly unalterable progression of blind forces. All those faculties that might allow such individuals to perceive the contrast between the falsification wrought by the Spectacle and the early forms are likewise eradicated. The antagonism between human life and the economy is emphasized even more strongly by Debord than by Marx and Lukács. Lukács underlines the fact that even in earlier societies, divided into estates, the economy was already the basis of all social relations, although that economy had not, quote, objectively reached the stage of being for itself, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, 57. In the modern period, by contrast, quote, economic factors are not concealed, quote, behind, end quote, consciousness, but are present in consciousness, in consciousness itself, albeit unconscious or repressed, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, 59. In another passage, Lukács evokes, quote, the first time, bracket, that end bracket, mankind consciously takes mankind's history into mankind's own hands, thanks to the class consciousness of a proletariat summoned to power, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, 250, thus bringing to an end the necessity merely to interpret and follow along behind the objective course of the economic process. Footnote, the text quoted here is The Changing Function of Historical Materialism, originally a speech given in 1919 during the Hungarian Council Republic, according to Lukács's preface, 1923, to History and Class Consciousness. This essay still contains, quote, the echoes of those exaggerated sanguine hopes that many of us have cherished at that time concerning the duration and tempo of the revolution, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, end footnote. Let me get some coffee real quick. Where am I? This is the point where the proletariat's conscious will makes the proletariat's conscious will's entrance, a will that Lukács calls, quote, violence, end quote, in the sense that the proletariat's conscious will means a rupture with the self-regulation of the system. From the moment when the real possibility of the, quote, realm of freedom, end quote, arises, quote, the blind forces really will hurtle blindly towards the abyss with ever-increasing and apparently irresistible violence, and only the conscious will of the proletariat will be able to save mankind from the impending catastrophe, end quote. History and Class Consciousness 70. Material production in the society of the future will be, quote, the servant of a consciously directed society. The material production in the society of the future will lose its self-contained autonomy, which was what made it an economy, properly speaking. As an economy, it will be annulled, end quote. History and Class Consciousness 261. For Debord, the development of economic forces was necessary, for the development of economic forces was only, for it was only thus that the economy could eventually cease being the unconscious basis of society. As the economy sways extended to the whole of life, the economy is simultaneously revealed to be a creation of mankind, and mankind becomes conscious of this. The autonomous economy, quote, breaks all ties with authentic needs to the precise degree that it emerges from a social unconscious that was dependent on it without knowing it, ... By the time society discovers that it is contingent on the economy has in point of fact become contingent on society, ... Where economic id, their ego shall be, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, sections 51 to 52. The task of the proletariat is to become, quote, the class of consciousness, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 88. Consciousness meaning, quote, direct possession of the workers of every moment of their activity, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 53. Instead of subordination to what they have created in an unconscious manner. History and Class Consciousness reminded all Marxists who had forgotten it that crises are not solely attributable to quantitative causes, to relationships based on the relative importance of economic factors, but also to a kind of revolt of use value. Debord likewise emphasizes the qualitative rather than quantitative nature of economic crises. Debord thus saw the recession of the 70s, when the recession of the 70s arrived, as merely an exacerbation of the general crisis of the spectacular system, asserting that even the economic aspect is due to a sharpening of the class struggle in which wage demands were coupled with a rejection by the working class of such junk consumer goods as modern housing. Debord's search for a subject or principle necessarily antagonistic to the spectacle led Debord to an explicit invocation of the proletariat, but also to a number of somewhat vague concepts, among them the Feuerbachian Guttenwesen, or, quote, species being, end quote, mentioned above, which was also taken up by Lukács in his last period. The fact is that we are getting close here to one of the limits of Debord's theory. The logic of the value form requires that in society based on commodity production, defined by Marx as, quote, a social formation in which the process of production has mastery over man instead of the opposite, end quote. Capital Volume 1, 175, social processes assume the character of blind forces. This is not a pure illusion, as it is thought by those who look, quote, behind, end quote, the laws, quote, laws of the market, or, quote, technical imperatives for an acting subject. True, for individuals under capitalism, quote, their own movement within society has for them the form of a movement made by things, and these things, far from being under their control, in fact control them, end quote. Capital Volume 1. This means that in capitalism, as in earlier types of society characterized by other forms of fetishism, including fetishism in the strict sense, no subjects, whether individual or collective, are ever real actors in history. The blind process of value has created them, and they must follow its laws or be ruined. What is not implied here is that history is itself a process without a subject, as claimed by structuralism and systems theory. The absence of a subject, which is only too real in present society, does not constitute an ontological and immutable fact. Rather, the absence of a subject represents capitalism's chief defect. Debord clearly points up is succinctly the unconscious nature of a society ruled by value. At the same time, however, Debord bases himself on the aspect of Marxist thought that assigns a central role to the concepts of, quote, classes and, quote, class struggles, concepts that were also primary for the workers' movement. Overemphasis on the, quote, class struggle, end quote, however, can lead to a misapprehension of the nature of the classes that have been created by the development of value and that have no meaning outside this development. The proletariat and the bourgeoisie cannot be anything but the living instruments of variable capital and fixed capital. The proletariat and the bourgeoisie have their roles to play, but the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are in no sense the directors of economic and social life. The proletariat and the bourgeoisie's conflicts, which is to say class struggles, pass of necessity via the mediation of an abstract form that is equal for all, money, commodity, state. Thenceforth, such struggles are merely struggles over distribution within a system that nobody now seriously challenges. The logic of the commodity form always decreed that social classes must become one category among others, and that all categories must eventually be detached from their empirical bearers. This outcome is manifest today. The modern individual is truly a, quote, man without qualities, end quote, able to assume a multitude of interchangeable roles, all of which are in reality alien to him. I'm going to move to a place I think might block the wind a little more. One may be at the same time a worker and a co-owner of a firm. Likewise, one may be simultaneously pro-ecology qua resident and anti-ecology qua worried wage workers with a job at risk. Even the ruling class have lost all mastery, and now the only thing at stake is economic competition. And economic competition is a more comfortable place within the general alienation. In the last reckoning, the development of society, which appears even to the most powerful as an inevitability to which they must adapt if they are to preserve their short-term interests, is a threat to all classes. The existence of a powerful proletariat, united not only by working conditions, but also by an entire culture and lifestyle and more or less excluded from bourgeois society, was in reality nothing but a pre-capitalist relic, a, quote, estate, end quote, in the feudal sense, and not a direct result of capitalistic development at all. It was precisely class struggle that helped capitalism realize capitalism's self by allowing the laboring masses to be transformed into abstract and equal, quote, monads, end quote, participating fully in the money system and in the state. The secret historic mission of the proletarian movement was to destroy remnants of pre-capitalism, to generalize abstract forms such as those of the law, money, value, and commodities, and thus to impose the pure logic of capital. These tasks often had to be carried out despite the resistance of the bourgeoisie itself, which was still determined to defend such actually pre-bourgeois forms as low wages and the barring of workers from the exercise of political rights, things the workers' movement too identified incorrectly with the essential nature of capitalism. The Marxism of this movement was perforce a, quote, sociologizing, end quote, Marxism, to the extent that the Marxism of this movement reduced the advances of capitalist society to the conscious activity of social groups treated as a pre-existing factor. The workers' movement therefore partook in a sense of the typical illusion of the bourgeois subject, which believes that it is making decisions when in reality the fetishistic system is the agent. This is not to say that these results of capitalist development in any way mitigate the system's contradictory character. They merely illuminate the illusion that the antagonistic portion of the system is one of the poles constituting the logic of capitalism itself. Quite rightly, Debord has no truck with the propaganda, but put about in the 50s and 60s, at the height of the Fordist era, to the effect that harmony had now replaced social conflict and that the disappearance of the working class in the traditional sense was the proof of it. On the other hand, when Debord deems it possible, under present-day conditions, for a subject to exist that is by definition, quote, outside, end quote, the spectacle, Debord seems to be forgetting what Debord had himself said regarding the unconscious character of the commodity economy, and he seems to forget it a second time when he identifies this subject with the proletariat. No doubt an attachment to such concepts appeared to him to betoken a salutary radicalism, but in actuality it was a conflation of capitalism and capitalism's earlier and unfinished forms. In consequence, Debord is noticeably prone to vacillation when it comes to defining the proletariat, which Debord sometimes equates in sociological fashion with the workers and sometimes depicts as the mass of people who are deprived of everything. Society of the Spectacle, section 114. Footnote: we should not be surprised in this context to see Gianni Vattimo, Turan prophet of what he himself calls, quote, weak thinking, end quote, proclaiming that, quote, a large majority of us are proletarians not in terms of property, but in terms of the quality of life, end quote. End footnote. I don't know who Gianni Vattimo is. End footnote. Debord set out in search of possible real occupiers of a place already assigned within a teleological vision of history, the place of the adversaries of the spectacle. The Situationists called in the proletariat when an agent was required to, quote, realize art, end quote, much as Engels had once called it in as the era of classical German philosophy. On several occasions, this problem was implicitly confronted, quote, for the first time, theory as the understanding of human practice must be recognized and directly lived by the masses, and workers must become dialecticians, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 123. Elsewhere, Debord was to say that, quote, it is not so much a matter of the Situationists becoming counselists as it is of the councils needing to become Situationist, end quote. And the Situationist Internationale conceived its role vis-a-vis the workers as one of waiting to be approached by the workers. The critique of the economy as a now autonomous agency and of separation in general reposes inevitably on the concept of totality. For Debord, the concept seems to refer to human community in the sense of a, quote, harmonious society, end quote, that is able to, quote, manage that society's power, end quote. Its opposite is the, quote, totalitarian dictatorship of the fragment, end quote. Quote, one of those fragments of social power which claim to represent a coherent totality and tend to impose themselves as a total explanation and organization. When, with the advent of the spectacle, ideology reaches ideology's apogee, this quote, is no longer the voluntaristic struggle of the fragmentary, but rather the fragmentary's triumph, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 213. If the nature of man lies in his historicity, this historicity implies that community is an authentic human need. Debord says that, quote, community, is the true social nature of man, human nature, end quote. But community is corroded by exchange. The spectacle means, quote, the dissolution of all common and communicable values, a dissolution produced by the annihilating victory of exchange value over use value on the battlefield of the economy, end quote. Genuine community and genuine dialogue can exist only when each person has access to a direct experience of reality, when everyone has at their disposal the practical and intellectual means needed to solve problems. In the past, these preconditions have sometimes been partially met. The ancient Greek polis and the Italian republics of the Middle Ages constitute the most highly developed examples, although only certain portions of the population were affected. But villages, neighborhoods, guilds, even local taverns can also nourish forms of direct communication whereby each individual retains control over at least part of his own activity. Where the spectacle holds sway, by contrast, a fragment of the social totality, having detached that fragment self from collective discussion and collective decision-making, issues orders via unilateral communication. This occurs wherever subjects no longer gain access to the world through personal experience, but instead by means of images, which are infinitely more manipulable and which in themselves imply passive consent. The Situationists were convinced that direct communication between subjects was sufficient in itself to banish social hierarchies and autonomous representations. Quote, wherever there is communication, there is no state, end quote. In earlier times, activities of an economic kind were liable to have non-economic determinants. In medieval society, for example, productive power could be subordinated to considerations of tradition, as when guilds limited production in order to maintain a particular standard of quality, or a nobleman might dissipate his fortune for the sake of prestige alone. It is worth recalling that almost all societies prior to the society of the commodity economy devoted their surpluses to feast and luxury rather than reinvesting them in a new spiral of production. The communitarian social form of old, whose dissolution was an absolute precondition according to history and class consciousness of societies contriving, quote, to satisfy all society's needs in terms of commodity exchange, end quote. History and Class Consciousness, page 91. Were thus social forms incompletely subordinated to economic yardsticks. Indeed, in his early work, Lukács looked back with nostalgia to former times such as the medieval period, which had been, quote, filled with meaning, end quote, and something of this attitude survives in history and class consciousness, where he contrasts a former, quote, organic unity, end quote, to the present-day rule of, quote, calculation, end quote, History and Class Consciousness, 88-103. His Lukács' reference to Ferdinand Tönnies in History and Class Consciousness is instructive in this regard. Tönnies introduced the distinction between society and community, viewing society as a purely external bond mediated by exchange among people in a state of permanent competition with one another, and community as an ensemble of concrete personal associations together constituting an organic unity which is the source of individual actions. Similarly, Debord condemns the society of the spectacle as a society without community. See Society of the Spectacle, section 154. In essence, Lukács and Debord both agreed with Marx, for whom the unraveling of the old social bonds deprived men of the security and plenitude that membership in an estate had hitherto vouchsafed them. Only in this way, however, could the free individual no longer determined by such affiliations have emerged. Footnote. For example, the first chapter of Marx and Engels, The German Ideology, especially the discussion of, quote, natural and civilized instruments of production and forms of property, end quote, or the section on, quote, forms which precede capitalist production, end quote, in Grundrisse, end footnote. In his critique of Hegel's doctrine of the state, the young Marx applauds Hegel for defining, quote, the separation of the state from civil society as a contradiction, end quote. In modern society, Marx. In modern society, man is divided. In the political realm, man is a citizen, member of an abstract community. In social and economic life, he is a bourgeois. The contradiction inheres in the fact that something that was originally one is now split into two antagonistic parts. The old estates were communities that, in a rough and ready way, quote, sustained, end quote, the individual in his integrity, assigning the individual a status at once legal, moral, social, and economic, in contradistinction to the relationship between the person who is a, quote, free seller, end quote, a, quote, free, end quote, seller of his own labor power, and the person who buys that labor power. The economic relationship between a feudal lord and the feudal lord's serf was not a purely economic relationship, but extended to all aspects of existence. The classes of the present day are based exclusively on social differences. Footnote. As a matter of fact, quote, Marxism, end quote, could perfectly well have deduced from this account of Marx is that in the last analysis, social classes have a quantitative character, and that consequently they are not a determining but merely derivative factor in the functioning of a commodity-based society. End footnote. The isolation, abstraction, and separation attendant upon modern society are thus an inevitable stage along the way to the reconstitution of a free community. A comparable teleology of Hegelian inspiration is to be found in the Society of the Spectacle. Quote, in the course of this development, bracket, of the commodity economy, end bracket, all community and critical awareness have ceased to be, nor have those forces which were able, by separating, to grow enormously in strength, yet found a way to reunite. End quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 25. Here, keep burping. Here Debord clearly expresses the idea not just that the various splits within the overall unity are destined to be mended, but also that these separations were in fact a necessary precondition of growth and reunification at a higher level. The same sort of determinism seems to inform the thesis according to which, quote, unitary societies or, quote, myth-based societies, end quote, are obliged to break down into independent elements, after which a totalizing and reconstitutive tendency inevitably comes into play, which is at first expressed in art and then in art's negation. This is the connection in which Debord quotes the lines mentioned above from Hegel's the difference between the philosophical systems of Fichte and Schelling, which he found in History and Class Consciousness. The reunification of the forces that have been separated cannot come about until the development of the commodity economy has revealed the domination of the economy over society and completed the mastery of nature. At bottom, Debord is in agreement with the Lukács, who, in the preface of 1967 to History and Class Consciousness, quotes Marx in support of his, Lukács' self-critical observation that he had earlier failed to understand that the development of the productive forces by the bourgeoisie had an objectively revolutionary function. That development, though occurring at the expense of so many human beings, was the necessary precondition of a finally liberated society. Implicit for both Lukács and Debord, it would seem, is the theory that the proletariat must inherit the world created by the bourgeoisie, a world that will thus merely change managers. This view is nevertheless clearly at odds with the proposition that the bourgeois mode of production is alienating by virtue of the bourgeois mode of production's very structure, and that consequently the proletariat must not simply succeed the bourgeoisie as master of this system. One might reasonably question, too, the underlying assumption that all the sufferings of the past are acceptable, in that the sufferings of the past were necessary to arrive at the present state of the forces of production, which is confidently expected by a more tortuous path to precipitate the revolution, just as all the, quote, economistic, end quote, theories say it will. This, quote, determinist, end quote, dimension of Debord's thinking may likewise be discerned in the claim that another factor has played a vital role in history, namely the consciousness of the gap between what exists and what is possible. I'm going to repeat that sentence. This, quote, determinist, end quote, dimension of Debord's thinking may likewise be discerned in the claim that another factor has played a vital role in history, namely the consciousness of the gap between what exists and what is possible. Whereas the category of the sacred formerly expressed, quote, what society could not deliver. What society could not deliver, end quote. The spectacle, quote, by contrast, depicts what society can deliver, but in this depiction what is permitted is rigidly distinguished from what is possible, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 25. The domination of nature should lead society immediately to ask the question, quote, what for, end quote, and then to use its mastery to transcend labor and replace labor with free activity. But nature's transformation, the great achievement of the bourgeoisie, is used instead by that class to buttress existing hierarchies and to keep the true nature of the functioning of society from becoming conscious. The fact that the forces of production must eventually subvert the relations of production remains true for the Situationists in a sense broader than the traditional one, not as, quote, an automatic short-term judgment passed on the capitalist production system, end quote, but rather as a, quote, judgment, passed on the development at once niggardly and reckless, which this self-regulating system arranges for itself, as compared with the grandiose development that is possible. With the grandiose development that is possible. End quote. This kind of finalism is reminiscent of the phenomenology of mind. Hegel. The Situationists, however, were in many respects immune to the excessive optimism which such a position often gives rise. Debord cautioned that critical theory, quote, expects no miracles from the working class. Critical theory views the reformulation and satisfaction of proletarian demands as a long-term undertaking, end quote. Society of the Spectacle, section 203. Debord notes that, quote, a critique capable of surpassing the spectacle must know how to bide its time, end quote. Must know how to bide its time, end quote. Even during the most intense moments of May 1968, the Situationist International warned against triumphalism. All the same, in a more general way, the Situationists persisted in thinking that post-war European society represented the last stage of a class society now several centuries old, which could be followed only by a general upheaval. As early as 1957, Debord was writing over-optimistically that the culture epitomized by Francois Sagan, quote, signals a probably unsurpassable stage in bourgeois decadence, end quote. In 1965, Debord announced, quote, the decline and fall of the spectacular commodity economy, end quote. After 1968, the Situationists, like Hegel contemplating Napoleon, or later the Prussian state, and like Marx during the 1848 revolution, thought that a, quote, upside-down world was about to be set back on its feet, end quote, and that history was on the point of being realized. In 1969, reproducing an extreme example, extreme at any rate for its time, October 1967, of the replacement of real experience by images, the Situationist Journal commented, quote, having carried its invasion of social life thus far, the spectacle was soon to experience the beginning of a reversal in the relationship of forces. In the following months, i.e. in 1968, history and real life resumed their assault upon the heaven of the spectacle, end quote. In part 2, we shall see how this came about. All right, so that's the end of part 1 of Anselm Jappe's Debord. The section that I have been reading was titled History and Community as the Essence of Man. Thank you for listening.